I'm Irene Latham. I am from Blount County, Alabama, and I write books for all ages of children, wide span of interest, and I have out now 16 books. 3 of them are with Charles.
My name is Charles Waters. I live outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I write in multiple genres within poetry, novels in verse, and picture books, and all of those good things. And I have 3 books with Irene, and 1 book separate from Irene that's coming out next year.
For me, I became a writer when I was very young. The family legend is that as soon as I could read and write, I was writing love poems to my mom. So I've loved poetry for a really long time, but I'm a shy person, and it took me many years to be brave enough to pursue publication. So I was actually a new mom with our 3rd son was a baby when I took a community education class and started learning how to get my work published.
I started writing in college. I was trying plays and short stories, and nothing really seemed to fit. So I am a professional actor, and I worked for a company called Poetry Alive, which is based in Asheville, North Carolina. They hire 2-person teams to travel across the country and perform poems as theater, almost like sketches. Except sometimes you have call and response poems, you have audience participation, and what happened was I had to learn over 200 poems in 3 years that I had to know by heart. That means not just standing there and reading, I had to perform it. So performing some of the best writers in the world for 30 months got me to a point where I thought I'd like to try poetry. And it seemed to fit me. And I've been writing poetry for young people ever since.
Charles and I knew each other through the poetry community for children's poetry. There is a group that gathers on Fridays online called Poetry Friday. So I knew of Charles's work, and I was working with an editor, Carol Hens at Lerner Publishing, and she had a great idea for a project. And it was to be a conversation about race between a white woman and another person, and she wanted me to choose that person. And I remembered Charles, and Charles's work is very different than mine, and the thing I remembered about Charles mostly was he's a very kind person. We'd never met in real life, but I took a chance and sent an email his way and asked would he be interested in having a conversation about race and our experiences with race.
It was Irene reaching out to me. We had been in different poetry anthologies, like textbooks and such. So I knew Irene's work only kind of. I didn't start reading more of her work until I actually got to know her. And she sent me this email out of the clear blue sky to collaborate on the book. At that time, I had accumulated a lot of rejection slips for my manuscripts, so I thought, here's an opportunity with someone who's established, and would I measure up? And Lucius Seneca, the famous philosopher, said, luck is opportunity mean preparation. So that's what it felt like with me collaborating with Irene. Here was this opportunity, and I was ready, and I stepped up to the plate. And we didn't meet face to face until after the book was finished. We wrote our first book, Can I Touch Your Hair? Poems of Race, Mistakes, and Friendship, using Microsoft Word and lots of emails and and a fair number of texting. And that's it. So God bless 21st century technology.
And the subject matter was such that we really had to trust each other. And so it really was about us diving into our childhoods and sharing some stories we'd never shared with other people. And so we really formed a bond, and a friendship was born out of that experience, and we knew we wanted to make more books together.
Outside of her husband, children, and her mama, I'm her biggest fan of her work.
Collaboration is really interesting. I never imagined that I would be up for collaboration. I'm really a private person, and it felt like a real leap for me, a stretch for me to embark upon a collaboration journey. Could not have picked a better partner than Charles. I think it takes a lot of trust, obviously, a lot of listening, a lot of putting the ego aside. Each book has been different, wouldn't you say?
I would say so, yes. For me, I had never collaborated before with anybody. And it's important to kind of be open to what life offers you. And now we have a pretty good collaboration going with our books. And I'm glad that I met Irene when I did as a grown-up, because our working experiences, there's no ego. You leave your ego at the door, best idea wins. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, Irene has had more experience in publishing than I have. So if she says, Charles, I really think it needs to be this, I won't hesitate to go, okay, and go with it. And that's important, that there's nothing is territorial between us.
So when we're doing editing as a collaboration team, we're not alone. We have a partner in that. We have an editor at the publishing house who helps us navigate those kinds of things. I can't recall any big problems that we had. It's not like we brought any issues to the editor.
We've never had a problem.
No.
I mean, it's very organic, I would say.
And we get along really well, and we're good friends, and we value the friendship above all. And so I think when it comes to issues, we are able to, let them go and make compromises, and, nobody's sticking their feet in the sand, and nobody's just...
Right. And it goes back to territorial. There's nothing territorial. It's all open and honest and respectful.
In our first two books, it was very clear, like, you write these poems, I'm going to write these poems. This book, A Novel in Verse, was a different beast. And we started out writing individual poems and to get some, material on the page. But then the real work began after that to edit the poems.
For us, the story goes to the day before this all happened. We were going to present at the Alabama Book Festival. We had just come from Tuskegee, seeing the George Washington Carver exhibit, and we're talking poetry because we don't see each other face to face that often, so we're catching up. And Irene said, Charles, one of the greatest novels in verse I've read is, because we're talking about verse novels, ironically enough, which is what this is. And she said, it's called The Watch That Ends the Night by Alan Wolfe. And I know Alan. Alan's a friend of mine. He's actually in the dedication of our book, Can I Touch Your Hair? And I've read most of Alan's work, but I didn't read that book. And if Irene reads a lot. I read a fair number too. Irene is a really quick reader and absorbs everything faster. And she said, when she said that to me about The Watch That Ends the Night, I said, I gotta read this book. And so the next day, not even 24 hours later, we're at the Alabama Book Festival, and then I'll let Irene take over the story about what you heard.
There was someone presenting about the story of Africantown, and I just saw the little blurb, and I just instantly just had this kind of magnetic, attachment to it. And I think what drew me to it was that it was a story of resilience and a story of hope and a story that I knew young people needed to hear. And Charles and I were together, and we started doing the research, and it just, neither one of us could say no to this project.
So for us, we find it lovely case of happenstance that we were talking about verse novels the day before, and we even talked about possibly if we ever created one, using some of what the kind of techniques that Alan Wolfe did in The Watch That Ends the Night. In The Watch That Ends the Night, it's the story of the Titanic, but he tells it from the iceberg's point of view. He tells it from a mouse on the ship in the kitchen, eating food and driving the cooks halfway around the twist. So we were talking about this, and then when Irene heard about Africantown, it just went, that's it. that's what we're gonna work on. And then we started researching once Irene got back to her home in Blount County, and I got back to my then home in New York City, and we just started researching. African Town is a book of poetry. 14 different poetry forms are used to tell the story. This is called, African Town is called an historical fiction novel in verse. So it's a novel in poetry, which is an art form that is getting a lot of attention now, and rightfully so. Personally, I wish I knew about verse novels. I wish they were written when I was in school. I dare say I would have gotten into reading a whole lot earlier if that would happen. There's something about poetry and the white space on the page and the black lines where it's not as overwhelming to my eyes as it would be a book of prose where there's lines after lines after lines, and it seems like it goes on forever. You read 5 poems in the book, you just read 5 pages, and you're off and running. And there's something about the economy of poetry that appeals to me. There's something about the language of it, the metaphors, the similes, the line breaks, that quite frankly excite me. And verse novels are as important in literature as the blood coursing through our veins, in my opinion. And seeing young people read books like The Crossover, for example, and I've had so many educators tell me they read a book called The Crossover, which is a verse novel by Kwame Alexander, which won the Newbery, which is the highest award you can get in children's literature. Very few books have won the Newbery in poetry. The Crossover did. I've had more librarians tell me students will come back after reading that book and go, what else do you have? And what, as a librarian or any educator, it doesn't get much better than that. What else do you have? I mean, you feel like you can live forever, and that's what poetry does.
So African Town is marketed as a young adult book, which I believe the publisher put 12 and up on it. And it's marketed also as a crossover book, which means adults are welcome to read it. Research is really interesting. I think going in, I thought we could split research, but what we found out was we both had to be equally as knowledgeable about everything. And that was a surprise. I thought we could divvy up more, but we really each needed to have a really comprehensive knowledge of the time, these individual characters, and that's how it worked for us.
For our collaboration, it's always been 50-50, and African Town was no different in terms of splitting up responsibilities. But then after we would do splitting up 50-50, we'd flip it. And I'd read what Irene had already read. She was reading what I had already read. And then the book started coming together. So it was very much a case of totality in this case. I mean, we both did equal amount of work, but we also jumped over the other side of the fence to see what the other person was doing and vice versa.
How do you make it work together? It's interesting because we decided to tell this story in 14 individual voices. So we knew that while it needs to be together in terms of a narrative that spans the course of the book and fits together, we had the freedom to bring these different voices. So I think that was really attractive to us about the project. It added a lot. It was also a big challenge. It's where we have to remember that this is not a story about a group. Often we refer to this group as the survivors of the Clotilda. These are individuals, and so much of our work was figuring out their backstories, their motivations, how they individually would cope and deal with the situation that they were put into, and how would they have any sort of agency and make decisions about their lives when they were able to. So that gave us a lot of freedom to bring ourselves and our individual voices to it, while also bringing their individual voices to it.
The great actor Willem Dafoe once said about acting, you have to earn your make-believe. And so for the gaps of information, we had to earn it in terms of creating backstory based on our research. And then our imaginations, and that's why I love historical fiction so much, because sometimes I can't tell what's real, what's imagined, and there's something delicious about that.
We were very fortunate to get to meet descendants as part of the research process. Charles and I spent a weekend visiting Africantown, and first of all, we started with this amazing book by Dr. Sylvia Ndiouf, who dreams of Africa and Alabama. It's a scholarly work, and she did an amazing amount of research. So that really provided like a backbone for our story. And then our trip to Africantown.
Our trip to Africantown, reading Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, reading multiple articles, including a long article about the Clotilda that was written by Ben Raines, who found the Clotilda 3 years ago.
But the descendant of Cosala that we were able to meet is Altaviz Rosario, who is fifth generation descendant. And Altaviz is an educator in Philadelphia, and she was able to do the educator's guide for the book. And you worry about what are the critics going to think, what are readers going to think, and Charles and I, our biggest worry was, what are the descendants going to think about this book? Our goal was to honor them and tell a truthful and triumphant story, and they're not our descendants. And so we felt we really wanted to please them. And her response was?
Her response was, we sent her a PDF of the book before it was published, and her response was overwhelmingly positive. For us, we also were super fortunate to meet Joycelyn Davis. Joycelyn Davis is a descendant of Aluale, who's also known as Charlie Lewis in America, and his wife Maggie Lewis. And we found Joycelyn through someone named Major Joe Womack, who is not a descendant but has done heroic work in Africantown. And Joe has connected us to Joycelyn, who agreed to write the introduction to the book, which was very gracious of her. And again, it's one of these things where we've been very fortunate with the descendants. They don't know us, we're outsiders, but they took it on faith that we would provide we would give their ancestors dignity and tell the story as true as possible, given the research we had. So Joycelyn connected us to Altaviz, and that's how it's come to be. We were in Africantown 2 to 3 weeks ago for this.
They have a festival every year, the Spirits of Our Ancestors Festival, and it was really incredibly moving. We also met other descendants.
We met other descendants, someone named Delisha Marshall, who is a descendant of Gumpa, and
Peter Lee,
and whose American name was Peter Lee. One thing that Irene and I did was, in reading Barracoon, was that Kosala told, no, that's not what
it was. Emma Langdon Roche.
It was Langdon Roche. Kosala told someone named Emma Langdon Roche, who was also researching the Clotilda Africans. He told her that they would like to be known as their African names. So we kept that in mind in working on the book. So when I say Gumpa, I mean Peter Lee, but Gumpa's married in my head now because that's what Kosala would have wanted. So that's how we approach this project.
So our publisher is Penguin Random House, the imprint is G.P. Putnam's Sons, and our editor is Stacy Barney. And Stacy Barney and the publishing house as a whole encourages collaboration. They had us in on every step of the process in terms of the cover design, the interior illustrations. Our input was welcome equally. There was no leaving anyone out. We are equals in this with the publisher as well. And they bent over backwards to accommodate the things that we felt like were most important. For instance, the title of the book, African Town, today it's known as Africa Town, and just like Charles was talking about the request from Clotilda that they be known by their African names. When they founded the town, they named it African Town at the time. So we were trying to be as historically accurate and honor their wishes as much as we could.
The Clotilda in our book came to be because, while 24 hours before Irene overheard about African Town during the Alabama Book Festival, we were talking about how Alan Wolfe in his book, The Watch That Ends the Night, uses the iceberg as a character and other I won't say objects, but he uses things that you wouldn't think of to use in a book. And when it came time for us to start researching, it made sense to use the Clotilda as a voice in the story, as almost like the moral conscience, as something the reader might be feeling as they're reading about the horror that the Clotilda Africans faced, from the kidnapping to the Middle Passage to coming into Mobile Bay before being shipped off. So that's how that came to be. It just, some things just make sense, and giving the Clotilda a voice made sense to both of us.
Yeah, there is a challenge with historical fiction for children in making it applicable to their lives. And the Clotilda was a vehicle for us to give current day, because we all have an awareness about slavery that the characters in our book did not. So the way they speak about ownership of property and how they make decisions, our kids today need to understand that history, and the Clotilda's voice kind of operated as a bridge to help them understand how it applies to them and how it operated in history.
That is something that Irene and I both did in writing about the Clotilda. Is we both wrote that together. Sometimes we wrote poems separately, but that one we were in lockstep with each other, trying to give her the proper voice to tell the story.
And our editor was a great help with that as well. She gave guidance about when we sent our first draft to her. She had some more guidance for us about the Clotilda's voice.
Editors are magical people. You always listen. It's very important to listen to your editor. They know secrets. They know things. They always improve. In my experience, they've always improved a manuscript. In writing about William and what happened when he is on the ship at night when it's quiet, listening to the Africans below, moaning and what have you, and the horrors that they're facing, and him feeling kind of a tinge of guilt, maybe even a tinge of humanity, and then pressing it down. I mean, I think that happens. We don't know if that happened to him, but we know in society, and since time immemorial, how many times does somebody do something that maybe they know is wrong, but they don't care, or their conscience maybe whispers to them and they push it aside. And I mean, that's just something that has been happening for how many centuries? So we thought that William would be no different in that. And
it was also talking about William and that moment when he has this almost, moment of feeling what they feel. We want to write a book of hope. That was our goal all along, was to be hopeful. And there was so much to be hopeful about and to be inspired by these people. And we want hope for William's descendants too. And that the attitudes have changed since 1860 when William's sitting on that ship. And part of the research proved that out as well. Dr. Deas, in her book, she also found reason to believe that William might have a softening that we did not see in Timothy Mayer, the person who financed the whole venture. So that gave us an opportunity to show readers change, very slight, very tiny, and that's what it takes, is these shifts come internally that ripple out into our society. So Augustine Mayer is the son of Timothy Mayer, and it was really interesting to get into his character and imagine changes that might happen with his thinking compared to his father's. Now, Timothy Mayer was ruthless. He was cruel. He had no love for the Clotilda Africans. I mean, it was terrible, the way he treated, not just while they were enslaved, but after they were freed. And I'm a parent of 3 sons. I'm imagining kids listening to their parents and how often kids will find fault with how their parents do things and veer off. And so when we thought about Augustine, we imagined him as being one of these kids who sees this cruelty and it doesn't make sense to him. And so we wanted to make him more compassionate, to see Cosila particularly as a person who had some intellect, as a person, just flat out as a person, I think, because his father did not.
Mm-hmm. And that's from our research as well, mm-hmm. because when Cudjoe Jr. Is in prison for murder, mm-hmm. Augustine signs a petition to help get him released, mm-hmm. which ultimately is what happened, mm-hmm. which would have been unthinkable, his father doing something like that. So every generation, mm-hmm. things get pushed a little forward in terms of humanity, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened, at least with in this instance, with Augustine and Cudjoe Jr.
Something else really interesting about Timothy Mayer and creating his character, and this was something that we talked with the editor about too, is when we first created him, he was just this like bad guy villain, and we had to really dig in to figure out what he was thinking. It's hard. That was one of the real challenges, just to put yourself in that head. You know, that's not a space any of us want to go.
It was a tough headspace.
That was tough.
Because you're talking about somebody who did unspeakable mm-hmm. acts and was unapologetic about it, which is even worse.
Mm-hmm. But we had to portray him as a man of his time, thinking in the ways that people were thinking in 1859, and to be accurate for our story. So it really, that challenged us.
A man who loved his family, mm-hmm. who wanted to provide, to give his family a good name, mm-hmm. ironically enough, through hard work and discipline, but also doing these unspeakable things. It was tough to kind of thread that needle and not make him a mustache-twirling villain.
Mm-hmm. One of the big moments for us since the book has been released was going down to Africatown to the Mobile County Training School, which is a school that the ancestors built
yes.
and created, and speaking to the students there, middle school students there, and we asked the question, how many of you know this story? Did any hands go up?
No.
They're on the hallowed ground, you know, of where this happened, and they aren't aware of that story. And it just like validated so much in us about why it was important to bring this story forward. These are inspiring humans that we can all learn from. Today, yesterday, tomorrow, their resilience, their creativity, their problem solving, the way they never lost hope. It inspires me every day still, mm-hmm. you know, just thinking about these human beings and all they accomplished.
These stories of the history of our country are not talked about enough, and at least they weren't when I went to school. When I spoke with Irene, she said the same thing. I mean, I didn't know about the 1921 Tulsa massacre until 2 years ago. African town, a little longer. The Japanese internment during World War II, I knew nothing about. These stories need to be told, and there's so many more. And it's our honor to be ambassadors of this story, and hopefully others that may bring to light stories that aren't told about our country. And that's encouraging. That's encouraging. You're never too late to learn, and that's something that I've taken with me from this book and this experience. It's expanded my mind, and given me hope and just a deeper appreciation for the Clotilda Africans, because I couldn't have handled it. I mean, these are extraordinary humans. Extraordinary, incredible what they survived and what they built, and it's still around today. The church that they built, they still have service, and it's still around. Mobile County Training School, which they founded, it's still around. The graveyard they created is still around. I mean, and descendants, some of their descendants still live there. It's gotten me more interested in my family history and lineage, which I know thrills my mother. So, yes, I think this is something I dare say with Irene. This is a story that we're going to take with us for the rest of our lives. Long after this book is finished, but long afterwards, in other books that we create, the story of the Clotilda Africans will always be in our hearts.